And Councilwoman Price, I want to welcome you to the podcast for the first time. I appreciate your incredible patience throughout this, I know, frustrating process of technology, but here we are. We're going to get it. We're going to record this daggone podcast, and we're going to release it for all the world to hear. So, Councilwoman, welcome for the first time on a Minor Detail podcast.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I'm really honored to be here. I was starting to think that it was me and that, you know, the world or the state wasn't destined to hear from little old Talbot County.
No. Well, before we begin, Talbot County, of course, has a very special place in my heart. I was married in Talbot County. I was engaged in Talbot County. I've had some of the greatest memories of my life over in Talbot County. And it started out in St. Michael's, started out in Easton. You know what? I was telling you offline the other day, I think I spend most of my disposable income over in Talbot County. And folks like yourself and my friend Len Foxwell and many others, they say, all right, when are you moving across? When are you getting the heck out of Gaithersburg, you and the wife and the kids, and just setting up shop over in either Easton or St. Michael's or somewhere in between? And you know what? Every time I get stuck in traffic, I'm closer. I am closer and closer, Councilwoman, to just moving the heck over across the bridge.
Well, and speaking of bridge, oh my goodness, I mean, the traffic's only going to get worse, but the subject of our conversation is not the Bay Bridge crossing tonight, but Kirwan. But I've also told you offline that I'm really looking forward. We like the fact that you spend your disposable income here, and we need you to move here because we got to pay for Kirwan, and I think that your whole salary will pay for Talbot County Sheriff Kirwan. Maybe not.
Well, how much money do you think I make?
That's just a minor detail, isn't it?
Oh, that's good. I like it. You're on top of. You are sharp. Councilwoman, so before we get into the crux of our conversation, which of course is Kirwan, otherwise known as the Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, and we're going to talk all about how it got started, what it means for the state, about the work group meetings, and then the funding, and then how it's going to affect the local counties. And you're going to speak a little bit about your position as a MACo representative. But first, I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your political background and how you got started in Maryland politics.
Sure. I am Eastern Shore, Talbot County native. My parents grew up in Caroline County, so I've pretty much lived here my whole life, left for a little while, lived in Hartford County for a few years when I got married to my husband. We spent 3 years in Colorado, but we've been back here for 17 years, raised our children who are both college graduates now, so I have that behind me, woohoo. And about 10 years ago, as a small business owner, I had some people approach me and ask me to run for office because there wasn't anybody else on the county council who signed the front of a paycheck, and that's an important representation to have. So they twisted my arm real hard. It didn't take much, and I ran for council for the first time in 2010 and was honored to be elected to the council, and just got elected for the third time last year in 2018, and it has it's been really great. And what has really enhanced this whole position is getting involved with MACo. We see so much of the partisan politics at the federal and the state level, and I have really learned through my time with MACo that at the local level, the D and the R just really don't matter at all when we go up into legislative committee, which I've been doing now for the last 5 years, along with being on their board of directors and now an officer with the organization. We leave that partisan hat at the door. And you might think that sounds cliche, but we really do. And the big counties, the little counties, and every county in between, we really do sing from the same songbook, and we finish each other's sentences, and we all have the same issues, just on larger scales and smaller scales. and it's just an incredible group of people. The staff is top-notch, and I couldn't be happier to be such an integral part of the state and the legislative process without actually having to be an elected official for, being a delegate or a senator. I think we get a lot more done as an organization. The legislators, MACo doesn't by any chance get everything that we want, but we do have a very strong voice, and if legislation is going to be really bad, in some ways we can make it better, and we have a lot of suggestions. And I am glad that the legislators, do listen. This is not enough.
Well, Councilwoman, you've reached the point of, as your tenure as a county councilwoman, it's my understanding you're the president of the council. Is that correct?
No. That's voted on by the councilors themselves, and I've kept myself so busy with MACo that I'd rather put my extra time and my extra focus into MACo. It doesn't really serve any additional purpose to be, president of the council. It's just a lot of extra paperwork and whatnot, and we all. Or was it that you were
you were the top vote getter?
Well, yes, and that I'm really honored, because that's what the citizens said, and it's pretty cool to run 3 times and move up in the standings each time. It shows to them that you're listening to what they have to say. I mean, what a concept, right? Listen to what your citizens say, and they'll put you back in office.
That's right. And so where I come from and where I hail from, my native county is Washington County, and they have this sort of interesting way about doing business that apparently if you're the top vote getter in Washington County, in the county, and on the county-wide level, they have a commissioner form of government, then you will then become the council or the county commissioner president. So a little bit different, but nonetheless, here we are today. MACo, for anyone who is listening, doesn't know the acronym MACo, M-A-C-O with a little o, it's the Maryland Association of Counties. And it's an organization that is based out of, they're primarily headquartered over in Annapolis. And the sole function of MACo, it's a nonprofit, it's a nonpartisan organization. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention the Conduit Street podcast. Kevin and Michael do an excellent job, and I want to give them a shout-out. They're personal friends of mine. They talk about MACo issues in depth, but MACo, it serves the Maryland counties, articulating needs of local government to the Maryland General Assembly. And so MACo is made up of, and it consists of, county elected officials and representatives from Maryland's 23 counties and, of course, Baltimore City. And they set policy. They have a board of directors. And you're part of that board of directors. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And what is your role with MACo?
So 5 years ago, they asked me, I am the legislative representative, and there is one legislative representative from each county and the city of Baltimore. In the case of, if you have a county executive and a county council, then you have 2, but you only get a half a vote. So I think the best thing about MACo is the fact that it's one county, one vote. It's not based on population, which is what makes MACo work. And so being a legislative liaison for Talbot County, but also having been asked to be on the board of directors, and there are 16 members on the board of directors, and we get a little bit more into the structure of the organization itself. And then there are 6 officers, president, first vice president, second vice president, secretary, treasurer, and a past president, who make up the executive committee, and we get even a little bit more in depth as far as the organization and making decisions on, employees and budgets and things like that, which budget should be my middle name because I really am a numbers nerd.
Well, I like that. And so, Councilwoman, of course, the board of directors, Barry Glassman, who is the current county executive of Harford County, is the president of MACo. And this past August, where you and I spent significant time having conversations at places like Secrets, We talked a lot and here we are. We're, at the governor's event there, and I'm bouncing around between different events, and we're talking about policy. And it's really the perfect place because, of course, secrets, I never expected myself, to be honest with you, Councilwoman Price, I never expected myself ever to be talking public policy as it relates to Kirwan spending and funding at Secrets when I was there, several years ago with, 2 or 3 or 4 of my best friends, and as we're probably consuming way too much copious amounts of alcohol and sitting out all day. And I just never expected myself to ever have a in-depth, intelligent policy discussion at Secrets in Ocean City, Maryland, nonetheless during the MACo conference. So this conference held last month. It shed a lot of light on local county issues. The conference was held at the Ocean City Convention Center, always a great place to have a conference. The big takeaway, at least from my perspective, and maybe yours is similar or slightly different, the big takeaway for the conference was counties concerned about funding Kirwan. So I think this is a good segue into our primary discussion. And, Councilwoman, we continue to hear Kirwan, and there was a poll recently taken by Goucher College, and there was a staggering number of Marylanders who aren't familiar with what Kirwan is. They hear it repeated, or they read it in the news, or hear it on television, on local news, but they're just not quite sure what it means and what it's doing and how it affects education. They know that Kirwan has something to do with our state's education system, but they're just not quite certain what it does. So first, I'd like to shed some light, Councilwoman, on what it does, and I'm hoping that you can add in your perspective. But I always try to do with my show a who, what, where, when, and why. And the who of the Kirwan Commission, the commission is a group of educators and lawmakers known as the Commission for Innovation and Excellence in Education. It was named after the former University of Maryland Chancellor William Britt Kirwan. The commission was created by legislation in 2016, and it was formed to make recommendations on improving education across Maryland. It's a 25-member body, and the sole purpose is they are working to rewrite Maryland's current education funding scheme. So Britt Kirwan was chosen to lead the commission by the governor, the Senate president, and the late House Speaker Michael E. Bush. The Senate president had his choice to pick a few of state senators, including Senator Mary Beth Carrozza, Bill Ferguson, Nancy King, and Paul Penske. And the late speaker appointed Calvin Heddleton, Adrian Jones, Ann Kaiser, Maggie McIntosh, and Alonzo T. Washington. And you can go online to the Maryland Manual online. That's msa.maryland.gov, and you can search for the Commission on Education, Innovation in Education and Excellence in Education. And it tells you every single member who is part of this 25-member board, just in case you were wondering. And so what this commission does is brings together representatives from all across the state to review the findings of the study of adequacy of funding in education in Maryland, and to hear from national experts on world-class education systems. This has already taken place. And the commission was set up to make recommendations for improving education in Maryland through funding, policies, and resources that will prepare Maryland students to, of course, meet the challenges of a changing global economy, to be ready for college and post-secondary education and the workforce, and just simply to be successful students and citizens in the 21st century. The groups meet in Annapolis, and they have several breakout work groups as well. And I want to make this important notation that the commission presented an interim report in January of 2019 that you can also read on msa.maryland.gov. A preliminary report was presented in January 2018, and the initial interim report was presented in January of 2017. Councilwoman, did I miss anything?
That's pretty much it. They broke that down into policy areas, which I can expand on that. what I will say first is that currently there is $13 billion spent on education per year, split evenly between the state and the counties. And this new recommendation is supposed to add up to just under $4 billion. It was broken down into 5 policy areas once they started doing their breakout. And I can highlight real quick what those are. Number 1 was early childhood education at a cost of about $814 million. The second area was high-quality teachers and leaders at $2.8 billion. More resources for at-risk students in poverty, which is $2.2 billion. And college and career readiness pathways at $150 million. And then governance and accountability, sadly, only $2 million. So if you did the math on that, that's $6 billion. And so you might think, well, where are they getting $3.8 billion? They do think that there are some cost overlaps and certain things that as you bring a certain group of students up, that you won't have to put as much resources maybe into special education or whatnot. I'm personally not real sure how they're going to come up with $2 billion in savings when you have, the teachers at 2.8 and the at-risk students at 2.2 and then pre-K at $800 million. I don't know how you come up with $2 billion in savings, but that's a whole other conversation that the legislature will have to figure out. Well,
and it's a great point, and we're going to go into that. And again, the bottom line of the Kirwan Commission was it's a redesign of the public school curriculum, the raising of professional standards for teaching, and a redesign of high schools. So it's a fundamental overhaul of our education system, and the commission met and heard from leading experts, and they compared our school system with, I believe it was 4 other states, and moreover, the commission calls, as you say, it calls for a massive increase in state spending on education. And so we are here today. There is a work group for state funding formula, and that was named back in June. And there's 13 people that have met and are continuing to meet to review the new state funding formulas for K through 12. And we keep hearing this number. You said it was almost $4 billion. It's $3.8 billion. And I want to make mention that during the MACo conference, county officials and we all talked about how it's going to affect the county's budget. And I think it's important to note that the governor made a speech the last day on Saturday, which is traditional, that governors do that they usually unwind some sort of policy proposal. And the governor was quite clear in his ideas that he is not going to raise taxes. He will not raise taxes to fund this, what he is calling, he had referred to it as some half-baked policies, and he had also said that, look, he's not going to, I think he's dubbing it as the Kirwan tax hike. And you know what? I understand it, and we're going to get into some of that. But really what tonight we are doing is analyzing what this commission does, what some of the recommendations are, and your perspective from the county side and the concerns that we're hearing across the state from county leaders who are saying, look, we support these recommendations. We support the mission. We support the work of the commission. But taxpayers are coming to us and saying, how are we going to pay for this? And are there going to be tax increases? What's going to happen? How are we going to be able to fund this? And Councilwoman, I just wanted to briefly review with you some of those recommendations. The commission recommended that we have free full-day pre-kindergarten for low-income 3- and 4-year-olds. They want to raise standards so all students are ready for college or a career upon graduating high school. And as you mentioned, there is a work group, and they discussed one of the recommendations is establishing a strong accountability system to oversee the recommendations. And so,
That's,
in addition,
that barely made it, though. I mean, it's just when you look at the cost breakdown, and that I think is what Governor Hogan's main concern is there's not enough accountability. Counties are stuck in the middle of this whole debate over accountability too. And if the state passes a new law that says each county must, as in mandate, as in you don't have a choice, pay a share of all these new programs, where is there any accountability for the school boards? So, for example, if our county's Parks and Rec department isn't doing a good job and they're not performing, we can cut their budget or we can move money to a different project. But if every penny of the school budget is mandated by the state, what role is there for the counties anyway?
Well, and for everyone who's listening, who I'm sure is astute to understand how state and county funding works, there's an acronym called MOE, or otherwise known as Maintenance of Effort. Laura, do you want to explain Maintenance of Effort?
Sure. So back in 2012, the legislature, while they were also debating the teacher pension funding shift to the counties at the same time, and we never dreamed that we would get both. But there were some counties who, and there's a foundation number, and we can talk a little bit later about foundation, and that's the one number that we have seen is what the foundation number is going to go up to, which is the base level of funding for every student, no matter what, before you have add-ons for free and reduced meals and areas of poverty or special education or various things. And maintenance of effort is a law that was passed that said you must fund at least as many dollars per pupil as you did the previous budget year. So if you funded $10,000 last year, then next year you have to fund at least that much. But what they also put in was a 5-year rolling average, and they're going to look at the counties that are below that state average. And so if you are not at that state average, then you automatically pay an escalator of up to 2.5%. So as the bottom 12 counties get on that escalator ride, then they go up and then someone else falls behind. So it's kind of like a hamster on a hamster wheel, that it's constant. One county might start to catch up and then another county falls behind because it raises the whole average. And so, there are counties that end up increasing by millions every year, whether they need it or not. And so again, it's an accountability thing. We're never looking at zero-based budgeting. And that very same year, they also shifted a large portion of the teacher pensions over to the county, which then also got it added in to maintenance of effort. So it was a huge increase. And I've been attending all of these funding meetings, even though I'm not a part of this work group. I'm just going and being a cheerleader for Barry Glassman, who's there all by himself, because there's only one county representative on this work group, and honestly, on the entire Kirwan Commission itself, only 2 of the 25 members were county elected officials. And yet there's this assumption that we're going to get half the cost, that the costs are going to be split maybe 50-50 with the counties.
Let's talk again. I just want to touch back again on the recommendation so we understand, so anyone who is listening understands what it is that $3.8 billion would be accountable for and what it would be spent on. And we're looking for more money, so the council is looking for the commission is looking for more money for schools where many students live in poverty. They're looking for transparent governance and accountability, which is ironic considering that they went into closed session about a week and half ago. They're looking for more. Yes, and I want you to speak to that in just a moment. They're looking for more resources for at-risk students, better teacher training, higher salaries for teachers, better college and career readiness, and again, full-day education for 3-year-olds and low-income households, universal pre-kindergarten and for 4-year-olds, which would add up to a price tag of roughly $3.8 billion. And, of course, again, they looked at other school districts around the country, and they studied, they heard from many experts. I believe they looked at school systems, was it Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and 2 others, I believe. Maybe one was Connecticut.
But Ryan, they went out of the country, and they kept hearing from a gentleman who kept talking about Singapore. And they're not, some of these other countries where they had these best practices, they don't deal with the same things. They don't have the poverty issues that we do. They don't have people coming from other countries that don't necessarily speak English. So we have the ELL program. So, really, they weren't ever comparing apples with apples, and they identify their students in countries like Singapore much earlier of which ones are going to go on to higher education and which ones are going to go into the workforce. So, I have a very good friend, Bill Valentine, who was on the Kirwan Commission until he was term limited out from Allegheny County, and we have weekly phone calls about it, that he's like, what they're talking about isn't doable in this country. So it just really wasn't a fair comparison.
I'm glad you mentioned Bill Valentine, because and he had written a letter that was printed in MarylandReporter.com, and it's on School Funding Work Group, and the opinion piece is entitled "School Funding Work Group is Stacked Against Counties." And the premise of Bill's piece is that only 2 of the 13 members of the funding group will be representing county interest, including Harford County Executive Barry Glassman and Rich Madaleno, who's now Montgomery County's budget director, a former state senator, and a 2018 gubernatorial candidate. And he said that he wrote that a large financial burden will be placed on the counties to help fund Kirwan Commission's proposals, and yet the work group consists mainly of state senators and delegates and education representatives. The counties will be tasked, he wrote, with funding these new unfunded mandates without an equal voice at the table. And he wrote that he's greatly troubled by the makeup of the work group. What do you make of that? Do you agree with that? Is that a cause for concern?
I do. And the other thing is that Senator Steve Hershey told me that they had asked for at least when they picked some legislators to be on the Kirwan Commission, they asked for at least 1 Republican, and they didn't get that. So it is also partisan, and again, we don't want to be partisan, at MACo or on this call or anything, but if you're going to have equal representation, obviously we needed more county representation, and we needed legislators from both sides of the aisle, because, they do vote differently.
But Councilman, there's some heavy hitters on this commission. There's, especially in the funding work group, of course, Rick Kirwan and Glassman, and we're looking at people like Matt Gallagher and Sean Johnson, who's the assistant executive director of the Maryland State Educationists Association, Rich Madaleno, Alvin Thornton, of course, everybody.
Sure, Dr. Thornton.
Yeah, Dr. Thornton,
Sure,
yeah, go ahead.
That legislation, that when the last time they tried to overhaul education 17 years ago, that was passed, but with no funding source. And,
correct.
Lightning strikes again. They're doing the same thing. So far, the Kirwan Commission has been meeting for almost 3 years, and they have not shared even a single piece of paper showing how it would work. So we, the counties, but really everybody, are left guessing how this is going to go. And now they've added 2 more work group sessions, and they still haven't shared a single piece of paper.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that leads us into the next portion of our discussion, is that based on all of these recommendations, and of course I had followed this commission, I think, somewhat closely. I'm sure there's a lot more that I could learn. Admittedly, I did not attend the meetings, but I have been following the conversation and the recommendations. I've read the report, and I would encourage anybody that is listening, who is listening to read the report. Read the Commission's actual 2019 interim report. It's called the Maryland Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education, interim report, January 2019. And look, if you can make it through 243 pages, good, you should. And this will really lay out what Kirwan is doing. Now, it's hard to argue, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the politics. I think it's difficult, Councilwoman, to argue, anyone to make the argument to say, oh, we don't need this. This is not something we need. All of these issues are majorly important. Now, we can disagree over whether we think 3-year-olds should be in universal pre-K. Personally, my kids, I don't think I'd want my 3-year-old in universal pre. And this is the time for them to be at home or in another learning environment. But that's our decision. I'm not saying that has to take place on behalf of any other parent. This is my wife and I's decision, how we want to educate our kids. And
well, let me say what one flaw might be with this. Okay, so when we start talking about teacher pay, there's a minimum base salary of $60,000. But did you know that applies to pre-K teachers? Now, I mean, yes, I'm with you. I was able to stay home with my children, put them in, something that was a couple hours a day when they were 3 and 4 years old.
And so did my wife.
Right. Not all parents have that luxury. But really, do we need to put a pre-K teacher on the same certification as someone who's teaching our elementary, middle, and high school students? So, I mean, I think that's something that's really blowing up the cost. And these teachers, they aren't all going to fit in our school systems, in our school buildings. So they know that they're going to have to use private daycare providers, churches, other places like that. But all those people are going to have to get certified to teach 3 and 4-year-olds, and they're going to get the same pay as someone teaching our kids that are in high school. So, so when you think about the recommendations, could they have accomplished some of the same goals, but not without as much expense? So that's just one example.
It's a salient point, and I think that most Americans, I believe, agree that teachers should be paid more for the fruits of their efforts. It's not an easy job. We all can, that is readily apparent. Teachers go so far above and beyond, and we're very lucky in Montgomery County, where our kids go to school, to have some of the best schools really in the state of Maryland. And I know that as we are very hands-on parents, we are actively involved with our kids' education. Education doesn't stop in their classrooms, just as the same as with your children. They're educated at home. We're constantly reinforcing with their teachers. We have a great relationship with our teachers. So I'm just speaking parenthetically, but
sure,
we can't argue. We can't argue that that Maryland schools need to be upgraded with not only some of these recommendations as well as the curriculum, but there's somehow in every discussion that we have, it's partisan politics that takes center stage instead of actually focusing on the numbers, the funding, and the recommendations themselves. And so what I've been witnessing, and I'm sure you have as well, because we read social media. I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm on Facebook a lot. And I see people blasting the governor. I see the Maryland Democratic Party releasing email blast after email blast to their network to blame the governor for failing to shortchange education, blaming the governor for this and that. And that's fine. I understand that position because the governor has taken a firm position that he is not going to raise taxes. But we lose the real, I would say, the real meaning behind this commission when partisan politics has overtaken it. And we see these back and forth tweets between state senators, Republicans, and Democrats. And education to me is so obviously nonpartisan. But the legislators down in Annapolis who are going to go back into session in January, Councilwoman, I think it's fair for all of us to say, hey, look, you support these recommendations. In a sense, many of us do. But every single legislator should be put to the task of explaining how they will pay for the cost of Kirwan. That is not an unreasonable question. It is not a ridiculous question. And it's not even a ridiculous question to ask the Maryland Democratic Party, who's releasing email blast after email blast that targets Governor Hogan for his position on Kirwan, to say, hey, listen, Maryland Democrats and Maryland Republicans, but Maryland Democrats specifically, you guys support this Kirwan Commission funding. Okay, great. Tell us how you're going to pay for it. Taxpayers want to know.
How about I give you a Reader's Digest version of how the wealth formula works and about what the average property tax rate is, and explain how the governor, of course, he doesn't have to raise taxes, because guess who's going to get to raise taxes, and it's going to be all put on the counties.
Break it down, Councilwoman. Break it down.
All right. This is where I go to town. So the wealth formula, so you would take property tax assessable base, which is about 2/3 of the formula, and your net taxable income. And you add those two numbers together and divide by the number of students in your school system. And that is where you end up getting the wealth formula. Some counties, and full disclaimer here, some people might think, gosh, why is Talbot County on here talking about wealth formula? Their tax rates are far too low, and they're just rich, and they should tax more. So I should have given the disclaimer at the beginning of this call, in that I am here to represent MACo and the 24 jurisdictions as a whole, and not Talbot County. So, a county like Talbot, though, we pay 75% of the school's total cost, and the state's only picking up 25%. And a county like Caroline is the complete opposite, and everybody else kind of falls in the middle. But you have to look at it as a whole. So, and the property tax rates. Okay, so the counties have two major revenue sources that make up about 85% of our total funds: property and income tax. 12 counties are already maxed out at 3.2%. So you pay a state tax, and then you pay a county tax on when you're doing your income tax. It's on April 15th every year, because everybody, I'm sure, is doing it at the last minute. And 12 counties make up about 68% of the population, so they're already maxed out at 3.2%. An additional 7 counties are at 3% or more. So we actually have 84% of all Marylanders paying 3% or more of the income tax rate. So I think that we can all agree that there is very little, if any, room for us to fund Kirwan through an income tax increase. We get some recordation and transfer taxes on real estate, but that's really just a very small drop in the bucket. And so the rest of our revenue comes from property tax. There are 5 counties who have a revenue tax cap. Talbot is one of them. You mentioned maintenance of effort earlier. They did pass, along with that maintenance of effort law in 2012, that any county that has a revenue tax cap or a tax cap, golly gee, we're allowed to break our tax cap to fund education. And counties have done that. We've done that. So the average property tax rate throughout the state is $1.05 per $100 of assessable value. If you include your town tax rate, so if you live in a municipality, that average rate goes to $1.19. And I have this stack of hundreds of pages of handouts from this summer from the Wealth Funding Formula Work Group. And one of the things they passed out was if every county added just a penny to their property tax rate, how much would that bring in? And it brings in $75 million. You think, that's a lot. Well, gosh, but we're on the hook for $2 billion. So you've got to multiply that $75 million not by 1 penny, but by 26 cents, which is, 26. This is a 25 to 30% tax increase on your property tax. So if the average person is paying $1.19 and you're going to add 26 cents onto that, that's what we're talking about. That's what Governor Hogan's talking about. But he has no control over the property tax.
So I just want to real quick jump in, and I want to say in fairness that there have been a couple of articles, one that recently was written by Kirwan Commission in the Baltimore Sun, and it's entitled "Maryland Leaders Have a Moral Responsibility to Fund Kirwan." And back last year, earlier in January, there is a think tank that pushes tax reform, and you might know about this, as an answer to funding Kirwan. And this organization called the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, they published a report outlining the ways to change the state's income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax in a way that would generate $1.9 billion annually by 2030 while limiting the damage to the pocketbooks of low and middle income Marylanders. Now, in fairness, the Maryland Center of Economic Policy is a self-described, I guess, the liberal organization. And so the commission, they broke down its funding recommendations of changes in the tax code that would primarily affect businesses and wealthy residents. And they said that would generate $560 million. And they said that changing the state sales tax to include a tax on services and online services, Councilman, which would generate $460 million, that they say that figure would partially be offset by increased tax credits for lower income families. And then another bullet point of their proposal is restructuring the state's income tax to lower tax rates for low and middle income residents while raising rates at higher tax brackets. So they want to reform the tax system. Now, another Ms. Commission, whose letter said that we have a moral responsibility to fund Kirwan's price tag, the $3.8 billion. And he goes on, they talk about the real issue is whether elected officials will have the political will to do so. Well, it's not necessarily the political will. It's just that, do we have the money? And that's the point. And we have to be able to find real and, authentic ways to raise capital. And this, he argues that tax measures could substantially boost revenues. Now, I keep hearing from supporters of the plan that they keep reiterating the point that legalizing of recreational marijuana, restoring the millionaire estate tax, and sports betting, and some sort of carbon tax is going to be able to fund Kirwan at its current listed price tag. Councilman, what do you make of that? Is that even if we legalize marijuana in the next session, and of course Kirwan will be phased in over 10 years, okay, the funding that is, would recreational marijuana be able to cover the cost alone of Kirwan's price tag?
No, it wouldn't. And you've got all kinds of other issues. I mean, you can debate that issue, but when you do that, there is going to be other factors that come into that, and it's not going to be pure profit, let's put it that way. But, the state might think that through their natural growth in revenues, despite the economic downturn that's coming, and, future spending does outpace their future revenues, and shifting from other areas that they can pay their $2 billion, the state does have the ability to raise new revenue, in the form of the casino revenues or the recreational marijuana, which will be on the ballot in 2020 and probably pass. But that's their half. And if all along the process, the state leaders have seemed really committed to doing all these great things for the schools across the state. And I'm not sure why we're all taking for granted that this has to be funded by the counties at all. Why should it be funded by the county government? If it's that good of an idea and the state has a plan to bring everybody along, maybe this should just be a state plan and let them pay for the whole thing.
Councilwoman, should legislators be asked, is it responsible for citizens to ask their fellow legislator in the General Assembly, whether it be one of 47 or one of 141, how the hell we're going to pay for this. It seems like it's a tough question for many of them because I haven't gotten responses. And as a journalist covering state politics, I have to ask these questions, and which you would think, okay, tell me exactly, break it down for me, how much I'm going to have to pay out of pocket over the next 10 years or whatever the formula calls for.
Well, what's interesting is this formula actually was supposed to be front-loaded with about 80% of these costs in the first 3 years. And the telegraph from the legislators in Annapolis is, oh, no, we're not going to raise taxes to pay for $3.5 billion of this in the first 3 years because you couldn't do it through those other options that you just talked about because they would take time. So they have said, no, this needs to be over the true cost over 10 years and not front load it. If they thought all of these things were such a wonderful idea, then maybe they would have a little more courage to say, you know what, this is going to cause us to have to raise the sales tax another penny, or we are going to restructure, and all of the people would be behind restructuring the tax plan.
Okay. I want to bring that up, and it's a perfect point. Why won't legislators tell us that we're going to have to raise taxes? Why won't they tell us?
Because as a county representative, as I explained before, our really only go-to thing is the property tax. There's no room in income tax. We don't have other taxes that we can share or create. So half the cost, unless the state wants to take it on all on themselves, and I'm all for that, is going to be caused by a property tax increase on average of about 26 cents, give or take, depending on what county you live in, of every $1.19 that you're paying. That you can take you could take that one to the bank for at least the county share of it. And how the state decides to pay their $2 billion, that's going to be up to the legislators, but it just seems like they're not identifying specifically what they're going to do for their half. The entire conversation, I'll give you a couple of quotes that I've heard this summer, and then I'll mention one at the end. One, legislator asked, what is their capacity, meaning the counties, what is their capacity to contribute to education funding? What's the capacity for locals to pay? Some local decisions are artificially constraining revenues, as in what tax rate. One asked, you can't currently change the property tax rates based on the value of property, and how could the legislature change that? So not only are you talking about possibly having a progressive income tax, now they're asking questions about how you could have a progressive property tax. An educator said, Maryland has the means. I'm an educator, not a politician. One said, this one's kind of cute, we have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. We've heard that one before.
Yeah,
but throughout any discussion, without any discussion, at all, they said there's been no discussion on how the state is going to pay their capacity. The only discussion since June, and I've been to like 6 meetings, is how are the counties going to raise revenues, and not how they're going to raise revenues, what's their capacity to pay. So there seems to be a belief that
as a county representative, councilwoman, let's break it down to the constituent council person relationship. Are you hearing from folks that you represent, from those thousands of wonderful Talbot County residents, are they concerned about what's going to come out of their wallet for this plan? Are you hearing what are you hearing on the ground?
Well, 70% of people in the state of Maryland don't even know what Kirwan is. So I don't think they know what's about to hit them. And I'm doing everything I can, MACo's doing their podcast every week. Thank you for having this podcast tonight. I've been writing articles. People have been writing articles. We're all trying to get the message out there. For those who have heard about it, and sure, they're very concerned. And, you know, in a county like Talbot, which has the highest number of retirees in the state of Maryland, they're going to vote with their feet, and they're going to leave. So Maryland has a tax problem. Maryland is one of the highest tax states. People don't want to retire here, and, you know, Hogan has tried to attract people here. He's trying to attract, you know, open for business. And you're trying to attract other companies to come here so that we can increase our revenue. But if all this comes along with this, you know, massive tax increase, which there's no way around it, not only are you going to maybe cause people to leave, but you're also going to have a much harder time attracting anybody to come to the state to live here.
So let's talk quickly about the funding work group. You have been attending these sessions in Annapolis, and the work group it's technically an informal group, and it's been acting like a public body. Yeah. What do you make of the decision for the Kirwan Commission to go into closed session? Was it last week or 2 weeks ago to begin hashing out these funding formulas? That
was interesting because they started out with the premise that they had spoken to, or that they had a ruling from Attorney General Frosch, and then someone asked if they had the piece of paper, you know, the letter. No, didn't have that. So it was a more informal conversation. And you're right, they had acted like a public body. They checked on a technicality. They are not. And there's a way to talk numbers. I mean, we've had, you know, any county council has work sessions in public where we have a sheet of paper with numbers in front of us, and we're able to have that discussion in public without giving away every single number so as not to confuse the public, as Chairman Britt Kirwan said. And, you know, numbers are confusing, and someone will take that out of context and they'll just go crazy with it, especially on social media.
How can you confuse the public? How can you confuse the public when they don't know what the hell it is? I mean, it's right. I mean, you mentioned the poll earlier. There's an overwhelming vast majority of Marylanders who, as we both have said, are not aware of what Kirwan is. So, you know, Councilman, is it a shock to you that the commission has been, you know, look, this commission has been out front and pretty transparent. I think we both can agree to that. I have been impressed by the way that they have handled it. It's been conducted professionally. But even last week, Prince George's County Board of Education Chair Alvin Thornton, Dr. Thornton, he objected to closing the meeting. And I think that for anybody who is an advocate for fair and open and transparent government, that this would have been a major impropriety for a commission who has been otherwise out front and center. And I've asked some of the members of the commission, what do you think about this? Why did you do it? Or I've asked some of the legislators, and they blow right past that. They don't want to talk about it. But process matters just as much as the outcome. If people have to be able to trust the process, and we know, especially in this day and age, that everybody is very skeptical of government, reasonably so. We see it today that people want to feel a sense of connected, to have that connection to the process. And if they go into closed session and to talk about funding, that's the aesthetics of that, to me, says it's probably not the best public relations strategy. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say, when they were having the conversation before they did vote to go into closed session, County Executive Glassman, who is our one and only MACo representative, asked if he'd be able to take the papers home with him. And by home, he meant home to the MACo office so that MACo could look at some of the different formulas that they wanted to talk about. Not that MACo is going to release it to the public. And he was told no. And that's what, you know, and only what he could remember in his head. And he's there as a representative to our organization that represents all 24 jurisdictions in Maryland. So that was troubling that he couldn't even take, the spreadsheets, the sideways pieces of paper back to our MACo office so that we could run our own numbers. So I don't know. I don't think there was a whole lot said or done at that particular meeting, but they said, oh, we will only make decisions in public. Well, if you start with 10 spreadsheets and you can only come back to the public with 3, you did make a decision to eliminate a certain amount of information. You did make some decisions in private, but nobody's really talking about what went on a couple of weeks ago.
Well,
but it doesn't look good.
Who told County Executive Glassman, who is the president of MACo, no, that he could not take the formulas back to the MACo staff for analysis? Who denied that request?
The chairman.
So Dr. Kirwan said no, county exec. Did he give a reason?
He didn't. It was really just a no, and I think everybody has covered that. I mean, the reporters that were in the room kind of went a little crazy interviewing people afterwards.
As they should.
Yeah, I mean, David Brinkley, the Department of Budget Management Secretary, he's the one who objected. Barry asked the question. Dr. Thornton, and then the other woman from one of the other boards of education who ended up, it was an 8-4 vote. I think one person was absent. But really it was only a few people talking. And so when I saw the raising of hands, I was really surprised that 4 people voted against it. And I went up to Dr. Thornton, afterwards, and I hadn't met him before, but I thanked him. I said, because I think transparency was really important, and he believed that there was a way they could have had the discussion in public without giving away every single number.
What's coming down the pike, Councilwoman? What can Marylanders expect in future work groups, and when is the finalized report going to be submitted to the legislature and the governor?
So there's going to be 2 more sessions, and I will say, really, there's been almost no decisions made. I mean, while this group has been very transparent, most of the time has been spent with Department of Legislative Services, Rachel Hayes, and APA, the consulting group, briefing this group on all the work that the Kirwan Commission did for 2.5 years so that they understand what came before them. It really wasn't discussions on possibly a whole new formula. There was never anything thrown out there like everything's going to stay the same. They've been kind of spoon-fed the information. Well, this is the premise we're going to go on. There's no radical changes. I mean, I think everybody's expected. I'll steal this line from one of the previous MACo podcasts. Was we all expected revolution, and then we thought there'll be evolution, and basically we're down to expect nothing as far as changes in any formulas. So we'll probably see those actual sideways pieces of paper, as Michael Sanderson from MACo likes to say, on October 8th, and they've added that session, and they've added one more on October 15th where they'll make their final recommendations to the full Kirwan Commission, who may or may not listen to those recommendations. They'll have their own ideas, and then they'll make their recommendations before legislative session to the legislature, who may or may not take those recommendations. They may do what they want to do, and that's, I think the likelihood is that the legislature is going to figure out, how much they're willing to raise taxes or how they want to roll this out and which priorities, which things are going to get funded first, if anything's going to get eliminated or scaled back. So
taking this full circle, this upcoming legislative session, it's going to be, I think, a barn burner. I think that Kirwan will be front and center on all of the legislators' minds. This will be, I think, the number one most discussed item of policy. I am going to be following it closely. You're going to be following this closely, especially as a county official, because, look, at the end of the day, you have to go back and, depending on what the funding formulas state and whether this is passed into law, you got to look your constituents in the face and say, I did all that I could possibly do. but your taxes are going up, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is when we're going to make it happen. And as an elected,
going to have a choice.
And as an elected official, you know that's not an easy discussion. It's not. And you have a group of engaged Talbot County citizens. I know that. And here in Montgomery County, look, Maryland's an activated and engaged place. Now, some of these numbers in the latest poll do concern me that people aren't familiar with it. But then again, it is legislators have an obligation to, I think, in part, run a public relations campaign to explain what's on the docket. For instance, today is October 1st, 2019, and here we are where there's a bunch of new laws that went into effect. Mm-hmm. And I think there's people, I talked to several people today that said, hey, I was at this convenience store, and there were signs up that kids couldn't buy cigarettes until they were 21. And I said, yeah. They're like, well, we didn't know anything about it. And I'm thinking, well, how are you not paying attention? It's been all over the news. It was a big ticket item during session. So,
but see, you and I are policy wonks, and we follow this stuff, and the average person doesn't. They don't. Newspaper circulation is obviously way down. People don't read that. Sometimes they get misinformation on the internet, and they're really just trying to live their lives and keep their heads above water. They're not following this kind of stuff.
That's fair. I agree with that. And I have to remember that you and I are probably I don't want to sound elitist, but I think we're part of the minority here, that I'm an active news reader. I'm an active social media news follower. And I write the news. That's what a minor detail does. That's what this podcast does. My job is to stay up on top of the news so I can break it down, and people who may just want to listen to what's going on can tune in and can hear little old Laura and Ryan talking about this. So, Laura, I think we've had a long, successful discussion about what Kirwan is, the funding. I guess I would call it some of the concerns around the funding. But I'd be interested to hear more of the legislators release their personal plans to fund this. I really hate to think that it would be turned into a partisan weapon. I don't want that to happen. I hate to see the Republicans and the Democrats releasing these email blasts, and they just want to attack the governor, or they just want to attack the other side, yet we're losing out on the real discussion is the financial discussion. We always have to bring it back to the numbers. And, the Maryland Democratic Party is welcome to release whatever email that they want, but I do believe it is an incumbent upon them. It's an obligation of them to break it down and say, hey, listen, this really isn't about politics, but this is how we are going to pay for it. And I think it's a profoundly unpopular sentiment to discuss. It's a profoundly unpopular idea to talk about tax increases. Hard sell. It's a hard sell to Marylanders, but we've got to be honest with people. That's why I press some of the legislators, and that's why I press the chairman of the Maryland Democratic Party, who I'm not there. They know that that I'm going to keep asking questions, and they are not my biggest fans. It doesn't matter. But it just all comes back to what's most important for Maryland taxpayers. People like you and I who are going to be footing the bill for these education recommendations. And we deserve to know. We deserve not to be BS'd. I don't want to be sold something. I just want you to tell me how much I'm going to have to pay and how you're going to do it. And legislators can champion these plans all that they want. Great. They're excellent recommendations. Sure. They did the work. The commission did its job. And it makes for great politics, because how really do you fight back against education? Well, then again, if you're Governor Hogan, I know that I think he's using what was described in the Washington Post as dark money to raise money to combat some of these, I guess, I don't know how to describe it. What's the best way to describe it, Laura? I mean, I know he's using I know he's raising money to push back against some of what he thinks is misinformation about, maybe disinformation about the Kirwan funding, and that's political fodder for his partisan opponents, and I understand that. But look, the governor came into office promising that he's not going to raise taxes. The governor came into office promising that he's going to be a fiscal watchdog for Maryland's taxpayers, and so far I think he's kept up his end of the deal, and that's just a fact. And so here we are today, and if there is a will to pass it, great. Just tell us how you're going to pay for it, and I'll let you have the final word.
Well, I'll just say you were talking about coming full circle, and so let's come full circle back to the MACo Summer Conference, which in August. And there was a sense in the room. We had a session that was titled "A Perfect Storm for County Budget," and because we actually do things in the conference center, not all its secrets, right? And the panel talked about the looming structural deficit in the state budget, and those types of things often turn into cost shifts for the counties. You know, for example, the loss of highway user revenues, and I could go all day on that, where we lost 90% of our funding. The teacher pension shift, the teacher pension shift, and also the obvious potential for a recession that almost all economists are predicting. And then there's the idea of billions in new mandated county spending on top of all that. I mean, that conversation really has set things up for both Dr. Kirwan and company talking about their goals, but then the governor and his warning about the huge price tag. And that was, the biggest topic at conference, in August. So, yeah, all your county electeds are talking about it. They need to really stay engaged and know all of these gritty details. I mean, I'm just a glutton for punishment to sit through it, but I'm glad that I am, because I do understand it. Two of my boys, they graduated from high school, public high school in 2013 and 2015. Now they're both college graduates, and I'm done with that. But, I started in elected office with the kids in the public high school, so education has been something that I've really followed, and what worked and what didn't work, just as a mom. Sometimes I take off that county council hat and put on the mom hat. So it's been a good perspective, and I just hope people really pay attention. And, sometimes they see numbers and their eyes glaze over. but it really isn't that hard to understand if you just say, I'm not going to get too confused. I've written a lot of articles. I wrote a lot of stuff over the legislative session last year, the different things that MACo's following, and I'll continue to write. So, follow Ryan. Hopefully he'll post a link to my Facebook page, because I write a lot of things too, and try to write them in ways that average Joe taxpayer can understand, because it's important. And you mentioned that poll. Well, the poll said that 70% of all people are willing to pay more for education. Okay, maybe they think a penny or two, but I don't think they realize it's 26 cents on their property tax bill. So you're right. We need to know how much is it, how are you going to pay for it, and then you take that poll again, and then you see, is it still 70% that are willing to pay this much, or do the citizens want you to scale it back? And ask them what their priorities are. Ask the parents what the priorities are in getting the best bang for your buck. We might not be able to do everything. We need to look at this as a buffet and pick the things that are really going to make the biggest impact.
I agree 100%. I'm going to continue to talk in depth about the Kirwan Commission, about the work group funding. This is an important topic that we're going to cover. Look, $3.8 billion, education recommendations that can fundamentally overhaul our state's education curriculum. This is also vitally important, and then having two students in our public schools now, these recommendations, the decisions made by legislators and this commission directly affect how my kids will be educated in Maryland public schools. And I know that you're going to be the watchdog on the ground over in Talbot County and from MACo. And I really appreciate you coming on and having this in-depth discussion. And for anybody who may have glazed over during the numbers portion of our discussion, I get it. Look, I really, really get it. But it's so important that we understand the percentages of, it's sort of wonky to sit here and talk about property taxes, but these are kitchen table issues, right, Councilwoman? I mean, this is why you ran for office, is to be a steward of the taxpayer, and
right. And
to make
no matter whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, you want whatever tax dollars that you have to spend to be spent wisely. And I don't think there's anybody who would want waste in government, that we want it to be spent in the best possible way, no matter what the price tag is. Just make sure we're, again, getting that bang for your buck. And
to quantify it, to make sure that that not only are the recommendations yes, they're important, but how do we quantify that? How do we measure it? We always have to be able to measure this progress. And I think in a different show, we can talk about where we have spent money in the state of Maryland on education versus our return. And that's an even bigger discussion. And then we can go into some of the curriculum issues that I find to be really interesting. So, Councilwoman Price of Talbot County, you do your service. You do your service well. Your constituents are lucky to have you down there. And as you said, this has nothing to do with partisan politics. Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, throw it out the window. This is about good governance. This is about responsibility. And this is about being straight with people and being responsible with people's money. That's what they elected you to do. That's what your constituents hired you to do. And I appreciate you coming on. And I know that this was a prolonged discussion, and I'm sure you're tired, and I'm tired. So
now
we'll go ahead.
Hopefully get this thing uploaded, since we couldn't go live. And
I know, I'm so sorry.
If I made a boob or whatever, you can edit it right out. So, but looking forward to listening to this once you get it uploaded.
I think both of us will certainly be interested in the feedback, and this is one of these wonky shows that I really love doing, and it's important. Education is the number one issue on, I think, most people's minds in state government, especially if they're an elected official. But we have to be able to find out a way. We have to figure out a way to fund it, and we'll leave it at that. Councilwoman Price, thank you so much for coming on a Tuesday night. I really appreciate your time. Sorry about the other night, but we'll keep chugging along, and hopefully we'll get this thing uploaded here soon.
Sounds good, Ryan. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks again.